As noted in the published agenda, the subject for today's session will be the risk analysis of alternative means. Before we begin, I would like to explain the procedure for questions from participants for presenters. The panel will ask its questions after each presenter, unless otherwise stated, such as may be the case for government and OPG presentations. As we did yesterday, the panel will consider, time permitting, questions submitted by registered participants at the end of the day, once the panel has heard from all presenters. Participants are reminded that questions must relate to today's presentations. We will now proceed with presentations by Ontario Power Generation and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission pertaining to the subject of the relative risk analysis of alternative means. The panel will hear both presentations before proceeding with its questions. I would like now to call on the Ontario Power Generation Independent Expert Group to begin their presentation. Ms. Swamy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Dr. Swanson and members of the panel. My name is Laurie Swamy, Senior Vice President of OPG's Decommissioning and Waste Management Organization. Today, OPG's presentation will address EIS 12-513, Alternative Means Risk Analysis. In this information request, the Joint Review Panel required OPG to have analysis undertaken by independent risk assessment experts. In order to meet this requirement, OPG hired an independent group chaired by Dr. William Lease. We provided them with the JRP direction and information necessary to respond to the IR. To maintain independence, the IEG had complete control over the work. When completed, OPG received the report and submitted it to the Joint Review Panel. Today's presentation is on the relative risk assessment of the four alternative means identified by the panel. Tomorrow, the IEG will present on the risk perceptions of the four alternative means for managing the storage and disposal of low and intermediate level waste. Dr. Lees, as the head for the group, will now take over the presentation.
Thank you. I have all my colleagues with me here, and we intend to make this presentation in 4 parts so that each of the panelists have a chance to speak. On my left, Greg Powley, and further left, Maurice Dussault, and behind us, Mr. Tom Isaacs. And so I will call on my colleagues at the appropriate time to continue the presentation. We will, in this presentation dealing with the relative risk assessment, present an overview of the questions we were asked, of the method with which we chose to respond to the questions, and a brief description of the type of responses we provided. We started with the concept of relative risk in order to define the parameters of our work, in the sense that the charge from, as we understood it from the panel, explicitly required us to employ the concept of risk in comparing different options for the disposal of low or intermediate level nuclear waste. Risk is defined as a concept that integrates 2 different aspects of a potentially dangerous or hazardous activity. These concepts are probability, often referred to more casually as likelihood, and second, consequences associated with different events. Both of these concepts are considered jointly when thinking about risk. Characterizing options on the basis of risk is distinct from characterizing options on the basis of consequences alone. While it may be appropriate in some contexts to place greater or exclusive focus on consequences, we have been asked specifically to consider risk in characterizing these options, which forces us to consider the relative likelihood of various types of consequences. This is a key component to understanding how our results may vary from other characterizations of the disposal options which have been and will be presented at these hearings. We will return to the specific components of relative risk when discussing the precise nature of our charge from the Joint Review Panel. We will now proceed to the next slide. And we have 2 slides on the 4 options that we considered, and I would ask my colleague Maurice Dussault to present those 2 slides and some additional comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lees. Madame le Président, ça me donne grand plaisir d'être ici pour vous parler aujourd'hui. Je vais parler en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions en français, je peux aussi répondre. I will speak in English. The options that were presented for us to assess in a relative risk context were 4-fold. 2 at the surface, and 2 that we call DGRs, Deep Geological Repositories. And before we describe the new methodology that was developed by us to evaluate the relative risk of these 4 options, permit me to describe the nature of these 4 options. The 2 surface options comprise options to place materials near or on the surface at the Western Waste Management Facility at the Bruce site. The status quo is what it says, the status quo, with the waste being repackaged on a 50-year cycle and stored in structures similar to, or perhaps slightly ameliorated compared to the structures that currently are used for this purpose. The second surface option is the enhanced option, which would be a somewhat hardened surface option with perhaps more shallow burial, speaking of a few meters, berms, more robust containment structures. And for this option, it is assumed that the waste containers are built and rebuilt every 100 years. And for both of the surface options, we assume that storage will be required for a very long time. The term in perpetuity is perhaps a bit much, but for the foreseeable future, and that means the foreseeable distant future. The 2 deep geological repository.
Next slide, please.
Thank you. The two deep geological repository options presented us with a little bit of a conundrum, because one is an actual physical site that has been subjected to fairly rigorous site investigation, and the other is a hypothetical site, which forced us to make certain assumptions as to what a hypothetical site would be, what the constraints on a hypothetical site would be. Nevertheless, the 2 options are deep underground chamber in the undeformed sedimentary strata beneath the Bruce nuclear power generation site, close to us here, at approximately 700 meters depth in the Coburg Formation. Access through a shaft that would later be sealed with appropriate engineered barriers. With the granite site in an unspecified location, we assume that the shafting and the mining and the sealing would, for all intents and purposes, be identical to that of the Coburg Formation site on the Bruce generation site. But it would be located in the Canadian Shield in an igneous rock mass of suitable quality, and with geographical and hydrological features similar to that of the Bruce site, so that a reasonable comparison of relative risk could be made. Now, we have available to us, of course, commentary that will be tabled later on during these hearings. And we felt that it was appropriate, now that these 4 options are defined, to address some of those comments in a general manner at the present time. Specifically, we have some comments from CNRS that we took extremely seriously, of course, and examined them in detail. And our first observation is that in the comments, it becomes clear at the end of the comments that the CNRS agree with our report, and they said so explicitly. With respect to the charge that certain phrases in our report are misleading, we reread our report carefully, all of us, and we have concluded that when taken in its entirety, that our report is not misleading in terms of its comparison between a site that is well defined at the Bruce generating site and a hypothetical site that exists in the Canadian Shield in Ontario with geographical and hydrological conditions similar to the Bruce site. It's important to assess the report in its entirety and avoid taking things out of context, especially when we're discussing complex and interrelated issues involving comparisons with hypothetical cases. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Maurice. Next slide, Greg.
So Greg Powley speaking now. So I'm going to review the joint review panel charge to the independent expert group as it pertains to understanding how we approach the relative risk assessment method. So the joint review panel provided a detailed charge to the independent expert group requesting a risk assessment with the following qualities. The characterization of risk among the options should be relative. The characterization should be qualitative, which we understood to intentionally exclude quantitative expressions of risk. And the process and results should be transparent, defensible, and repeatable. And we'll return to the method and the means by which we have tried to achieve these objectives and charges. As such, we defined a specific method to allow us to meet these requirements, the results of which are found in our 2 relative risk assessment reports. So more specifically, in addition to these qualitative factors, the charge to the IEG was specific in requesting consideration of a variety of sources, pathways, and receptors of harm. The specific category of socioeconomic impacts was explicitly excluded from our charge. A key aspect of the charge as well was to limit the scope of our conclusions to judge relative risk among the options on each of the individual criteria and not to provide a summary conclusion across these criteria, nor to provide an overall recommendation or characterization of the options. We have explicitly avoided providing any kind of multi-criteria summary score or risk estimate in keeping with this aspect of the charge and respecting the distinct roles of the IEG and the joint review panel in this matter. Importantly, we have also not characterized any of the options as preferable to any other options, nor have we characterized any of the options as either safe or unsafe. I'll now describe the 4 steps. So in order to address the charge to the IEG by the Joint Review Panel and to meet the timelines provided, we developed an approach which consisted of 4 main steps. Our first task was to review the Joint Review Panel charge questions in detail and to clarify our understanding of the 4 alternative means, that is, the 4 disposal options specified by the Joint Review Panel. Next, we organized the various criteria requested by the JRP into a set of pathways of harm to ensure that we have captured all of the considerations requested. These pathways are described on the slide following this one. We then prepared a relative and absolute qualitative risk assessment for each pathway of harm. We then prepared a set of observations to provide some context and analysis of our findings. As previously stated, there was no step that included reaching a conclusion on which of the 4 disposal options might be deemed to be preferable, safe, or acceptable. In step 2 of the approach just described, we assembled these considerations into 12 different criteria, which we refer to as pathways of harm. In using the word pathways, we mean causal pathways in the sense of potentially complex chains of cause and effect, as opposed to specific physical pathways. In using the word transport, as you'll see on items 3 and 4 above, we refer to the movement of radionuclides as opposed to accidents that may occur during transportation. Each of these pathways is described over 2 time frames, with 3 exceptions, being glaciation and loss of institutional control, which are only considered over the longer time frame, and radiological exposure during transportation accidents, which is only considered in the earlier time frame. In characterizing risk for each of the first 11 pathways, there is an assumption that societal institutions are maintained intact. For the last pathway, in which we consider the long-term loss of institutional control of the waste sites, all of the other pathways of harm are reconsidered in that context, with the consequences being effectively summed across these potential pathways under the loss of institutional control scenario. The relative exercise, risk assessment exercise, as a result, was considered essentially twice over 2 time frames. The first time frame reflects 100 years of operation of any of the storage options. The 100-year time frame was selected to correspond to the point at which it is assumed that the deep geological repositories are closed and sealed. It also reflects 1 life cycle for the enhanced surface storage option, and 2 life cycles for the status quo surface storage options in terms of the replacement of buildings and waste containment materials. The second time frame captures the long-term and perpetual storage for each of the 4 options. In this long-term period, the DGR options are assumed to be closed and sealed, with no expectation for any human or mechanical access to the waste. For the surface options, the facilities and containers are replaced and maintained according to their respective life cycles as long as is necessary for each level of waste. I will now describe some sample results. In the interest of time, we present only a few sample results in order to provide the opportunity to explain the method and the results. We will characterize the full set of results for 1 of the 12 pathways of harm, specifically worker health and safety. We'll also provide an example of a summary view of the qualitative relative risk assessment across multiple pathways of harm as requested by the Joint Review Panel, and the primary purposes of the second, and the primary purpose of the second of our 2 relative risk assessment reports, that being the multi-pathway view. We ask that you take note that there are no summary statements provided regarding the preferability, acceptability, or safety of any of the disposal options. We did not include an overall judgment and have never attempted to form a consensus in favor of any of the options, contrary to some characterizations of our findings which may be found in recent media coverage. Our process has been compared to that of multi-criteria decision analysis as well. In fact, while that's true to a large extent, in our method we have not completed the final step of a standard multi-criteria decision analysis approach, which is to weigh various criteria in order to render a preference ordering of the various options. That final step was not conducted. For each pathway of harm, and in this example of worker health and safety, we delineated what mechanisms of harm or exposure were considered to fall within that category or pathway of harm. We also made note of exposure types that were excluded from that pathway. And the slide provides examples of that type of delineation for this particular pathway of harm. In addition to various textual characterizations of likelihood, consequence, and risk, such as the previous slide and the following tabular slide, The relative risk assessment process was facilitated through the use of a visualization technique. In this technique, the status quo option, here in the slide a circle with the letter S inside, S for status quo, is always at the center of the diagram, and all references to probability or consequences are considered relative to this. As such, much more likely refers to an event that is considered much more likely when compared to the status quo option. The display also represents logarithmic variability in both consequences and likelihood dimensions. This is intended to reflect the reality that the relative probability between events can span many orders of magnitude, or to put it another way, they can represent differences by factors of thousands and millions in probability. This is the basis for including a logarithmic graph. In addition to the main relative risk assessment exercise, we included a qualitative absolute risk assessment component in order to allow the likelihood and consequences dimensions across different pathways to be compared and qualitatively communicated. I should also mention that the logarithmic variability applies to both the likelihood and consequence dimensions, in that the significance of the consequences, if quantified, could also represent many orders of magnitude in their difference. Once the expert group had reached consensus on the relative and absolute location of each option on the relative risk diagram and the inset absolute risk diagram, the overall statement of the relative risk compared to the status quo was described in a tabular format, and in the slide you'll see in the second row things like equals risk, risk with a single up arrow, and so on. We provided indications of essentially equivalent risk or indications of elevated or decreased risk expressed with one or more up or down arrows. In addition, the key assumptions that drove the assessment of relative likelihood and consequence were noted in this tabular format in the report. This graphical result on the screen now represents the same pathway of harm, but separately assessed under the assumption appropriate to the longer-term time frame. And at the top of the slide, you see the indication of the time frame greater than 100 years. This view illustrates one exception to the logarithmic nature of the graphical representations. In some cases, the assessment of probability was that something would simply not occur, or for the assessment of consequences, that it would be negligible for that receptor of interest. As can be seen in the figure above, given that the DGR options are assumed to be closed and sealed with no further access after 100 years, the likelihood and consequence components are denoted as, respectively, does not occur and negligible or no consequence. In the absolute diagram view, and that's the inset area at the top left in this view, the icon is placed on the axis to represent vanishingly small values, or zero. Once again, the tabular assessment was also provided for both time frames with separate sets of assumptions and separate assessments of relative risk, once again compared to the status quo option. The graphic shown here serves as a reminder that our charge was to express the relative risk associated with each pathway of harm. This requires the separate and then joint consideration of both likelihood and consequences and their integration into a single qualitative expression of risk. In addition, in a follow-up request, we were asked by the Joint Review Panel to summarize all of our findings in a single view for each of the two time frames considered. Our assessment resulted in considerable variability in the risk associated with the different options and for the different pathways. We reiterate the logarithmic nature of this diagram, in which both likelihoods and consequences vary substantially over many orders of magnitude. While we have not quantified the probabilities and consequences it is important to understand that if they were quantified, they would span several orders of magnitude. The range of risks is even more magnified in the longer time frame period shown next. Due to the nature of the assumptions underlying a perpetual storage scenario, the likelihood of many naturally recurring accidental or mechanical or structural failures becomes essentially certain, or a probability approaching 100%, since when considering a sufficient amount of time, they become essentially inevitable. The key differentiation for many of these events lies in the level of consequences associated with these events. For surface mitigated events like severe weather, glaciation, there is assumed to be either no consequence or minimal consequences for waste stored in the deep repositories. Some activities are assumed to cease entirely after 100 years, such as worker activity associated with the deep geological repositories and the transportation of waste between storage sites.
The final set of slides will be presented by Mr. Isaacs.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. So my job, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. My job is to provide you with a summary of our activities to describe briefly the characterization of the methods that we used in this exercise, to communicate our findings, and hopefully to show you how we met the requirements in the charge from the Joint Review Panel. We were given 5 criteria to use to guide our analysis, and that made a marked distinction on how we decided to organize to carry out this charge. The first of those was that this was to be a relative risk assessment, and that was to be the primary output of the exercise. And so we looked at each of the options compared to the status quo, as you've seen, for each of the 12 pathways of harm and for the 2 time frames. That was the relative nature. It was a qualitative assessment. It was not a quantitative assessment based on the charge that we received. And it looked largely at the relative likelihood of both likelihood and consequences, reasoning that more, much more, or much less were the kinds of distinctions that we would be able to make, and therefore we use the log-log scale because, as Greg said, this spans many, many time frames. We tried to be quite transparent, and in fact, we've received lots of comments, and you've received lots of comments about this analysis that kind of demonstrates that it was transparent enough that people could follow the analysis and the reasoning that we used. And others can legitimately and understandably come to different views on those rankings, but nonetheless, the fact that it was transparent allowed people to do that within that time frame. As you've seen from the presentation so far, we worked quite hard to describe option by option and pathway by pathway how we arrived at our conclusion for the scoring in that qualitative sense, and with respect to the likelihood and respect to the consequences. The repeatable charge was a little more difficult because in a scientific fashion, people expect to be able to conduct an experiment, and if you keep the same set of criteria, you should be able to repeat the experiment. This is not an experiment in that classical scientific sense. What we did try to do was to put this together in a way that people could indeed repeat this by looking at our highly transparent process and defensible process in a way that they could see how we reached the results that we reached, while also allowing people who might have different views on some of these criteria to use this formulation and come to their own set of judgments on it. So we believe we met those 5 charges in that way. The original charge asked us to look at community acceptance in the local and regional area. And in February 18th of 2014, we identified a list of documents we had received in this regard and statements of local support in the area here. We're also aware of countervailing statements by folks against the Bruce DGR and other options. And we believe and arrived at the conclusion that we would not be able to conclude the relative community acceptance of these various options in any kind of defensible way. In particular, when one looks at a theoretical siting of a granite repository versus an actual siting of a Bruce repository, when one looks at a surface facility versus a deep geological repository, we felt it was beyond our capability, and we wanted to make it clear that we couldn't do that. With regard to our final results and observations, I think you've already heard that we did not express a preference among the 4 disposal options. That was what we were asked to do, and that's what we did. It would take, indeed, some additional judgment and additional work on a multi-attribute utility analysis framework in order to do that. So we didn't, and I think that reflects the criteria that we were assigned by the Joint Review Panel. We had deliberately avoided the concept of a summary measure of risk or summary conclusion on these options, or on the alternate methods of disposal, or on the overall safety of these options. This was clearly a relative analysis. We understand and respect the fact that the level of consequences involved does involve some amount of social valuation. We could not avoid that. And it's also entirely reasonable, and not just based on expertise, to understand that some might have entirely different perspectives on the consequences and the level of consequences that one might associate with these various pathways. The most understandable and prominent one, of course, is the characterization of the consequences from the site being relatively close to Lake Huron. Those are judgments that go beyond our technical evaluation. We provided a technical analysis of our views of the safety, relative safety of the various options as they were portrayed to us. We did not include the social valuation that other people are free to choose. The last comment I would make is that when we look at these 4 options, the greatest distinction appears when one looks at the very, very long time frame and the assumptions one makes about the ability or lack of ability to maintain institutional control for essentially geologic time periods. In our evaluation, we, as most organizations who have wrestled with this around the world, have concluded is you cannot count on institutional control into the indefinite future. And therefore, that definitely marks one's views about vulnerability and risk to certain options if you believe that at some point in the long distance future, there is a loss of institutional control. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much.